you all for coming today to hear this talk about an argument for the total ownership of subsurface minerals by Indigenous peoples. The format, I was hoping to go for about 35 minutes to 40 minutes and to have some good frank discussion with you guys, about 20 minutes thereafter, and then we can spill over for some nibblies or anything like that, or you can just feel free to run away, that's fine. Look, this lecture is based off a paper entitled Surface and Subsurface Indigenous Land Ownership, Realpolitik for Fourth World Empowerment. Realpolitik, empowerment, fourth world. These are all important words for this discussion. So Realpolitik, what I mean by that is the opposite of conventional soft power. I'm talking, in this case, obviously not violence, well, everything is non-violence, but it is hard economic and legal power. And that's what I think is conveyed to Indigenous people if they're given sole ownership to subsurface minerals. Empowerment, yes, again, the ability to stand on their own, that's going to be another key. And fourth world, all right, first, third, well of those, all aware of those, but the fourth world, this is, as I'm told, a descriptor of cultures that do not ascribe to the normal telos of global consumer society. So these are people that may want to go into the wild. There's some cultures in Central America that have rejected towns, cities, and have gone and built traditional villages and have tried to work on a non-money culture. So this is what I mean by fourth world. Now, this paper was published by the Journal of Australian Indigenous Issues. When I was preparing this talk, the paper came across a little bit sketchier than I remember. It was a survey paper, so it was meant to cover some good terrain. So, if you decide to provide many generous citations for this, it's very welcome. Do keep that in mind, please. It is a survey and a sketchy paper. Now, some very quick key terms. IP in this talk, yes, means Indigenous peoples. I'll use it interchangeably. Pro 169. I don't mention this, but it's good to keep in the back of your head. Indigenous Peoples' Rights Program, International Labour Organization. Without this program at the ILO, this paper and this talk and other publications on Indigenous political theory would not have been possible. I worked very close, not in the group, the program, but close to it when I was with the UN early in 2009. Surface, anything above the soil, inorganic, organic. Subsurface, all solids, liquids, gases, organic or inorganic, beneath the soil. Now there's a bit of a definitional issue we need to go over. When we're talking about surface, how high do we go? Do we go up to space, different atmospheres? And if we're talking about depths, do we go to the Earth's core or to its crust or whatever? And how does that play out with the curvature of spaces, especially for very large territories? I'm not sure if anyone is really defining these things in land claims. But that's for a different talk. So today, what's the problem? The problem is that Indigenous peoples, for the vast majority, do not have inalienable legal ownership of their subsurface minerals. Even those that have undisputed legal ownership of surfaces, in many cases do not have undisputed legal ownership of that which rests beneath the surface. Why does it matter? Let's have a look here. It's a significant problem because mining is typically disruptive of surface, food crops, animals, and for me, most importantly, the ethos that Indigenous peoples have toward land, toward water. It's a history of land, a future of land. It's part of their cultural integrity for many Indigenous peoples. Now we'll look at a couple of case studies, and we'll see that those peoples that lose their mineral rights suffer what I call cultural consequences of dispossession and disempowerment. They're effectively told that minerals and money, which should be theirs and are not, matter more, and are more important and more powerful than sovereign national rights and the sacredness of cultural practices. Now, to me, that comes across as very much like a slap in the face, and I don't really see it any other way. It's pretty tough. Now, we're going to have a look at some media So just to show that this is a big international hot topic. This is all of this source material is from Al Jazeera, by the way. This is an image of ostensibly indigenous peoples, 2 men in Guatemala, that are scavenging for gold or precious metals in a tip, in a rubbish dump. They would not be doing this, the argument goes, if they had actual rights or some profit generated from the minerals that were coming out of their own territorial lands. These people don't enjoy these rights. And there's quite a lot of protesting going on in Central America on this topic. Also, this is extremely dangerous. I mean, this can't be good for your health. It's a big worry. Now, this is a different example from the north of Canada. This is the Atuapai village, or one of them. It exists, this village, 90 kilometers away from a diamond mine. And it's very clear that this diamond mine exists in their sovereign territory. This is their own land. And we'll see a video speaking about this, so I don't want to go on too more, but just remember that 90 kilometers distance. And now those are 2 examples of bad news. And here's a bit of good news. I'm going to hold the US and its legal system on a pedestal today. I rarely do that. But I think that this is really something that needs to be appreciated. Just last year, $3.4 billion in a settlement, which I presume came from one or more high courts. $3.4 billion of repayment for a century or more of abuse to Native American land in a specific area of the US, of what's today called the USA. 1.5 billion is to go to 300,000 Native Americans. Now, if we do the math, that only comes down to about 5,000 per person, which isn't much, but at least something. And 1.9 billion will be used to consolidate tribal land. So I imagine that means buying it back, trying to rebuild the territory, and continue their practices of managing, of healing in the ethos way, healing the land, looking after it. So that's good news. Here's a video on the Atuapai. This is inside story, I think. "90 kilometers away from a diamond mine on their own land, and this is happening. It is completely disturbing and wrong. I can't stress that more. The next video, we're going to go slightly more south. We'll look at Ecuador. Existential threat. Completely destroyed. Mining is potentially a doom sentence for Indigenous people. It risks destroying their culture. It puts human beings, to some extent, on an endangered list, on an extinction list. It goes by case, but the risk is still very much there. Now that was an example of media, right? Let's go back to my paper and take 2 case studies. The first, I'll argue to be a people, a nation with no or little or marginalized control over their subsurface minerals. So this is the Yolngu Nation, pardon my pronunciation, I think I got that one wrong, found up north in Australia. Here's a closer snapshot of what's Gulf Peninsula, I believe. And if we look right next to the A, if you go to the left, there's a bit of a black smudge there. And we're going to zoom in on that in this next frame. This, I believe, is a bauxite mine. Bauxite requires huge amounts of volume to go through to get at the mineral itself. It effectively ruins anything else, any capacity for that land to happen. Now, as the story goes, the Yolngu Nation, they own quite a lot of land up there, and in this part of Gulf Peninsula, they were relocated, effectively asked or forcibly asked to leave. Now, there is an act in the Northern Territories that we'll come and have a look at. I'm happy to argue at this point later, but the act says that Indigenous peoples in the Northern Territories, especially in this area, have the right to contest mining. But it is a point of embargo, it's not a point of veto. So there's a period of time that passes by. It doesn't matter if the community itself comes across cohesively. It should come across cohesively. What happened, we're told, is that a splinter of those in the community who wanted to have mining came through after about 4 years of negotiations, and that resulted in mining. Now, $9 million, we're told, goes to the Yolngu Nation as their entitlement of reward per year. I'm also told, however, that the majority of that money does not go to the Yolngu Nation. I'm unsure what monies do go to them and who it goes to, but I am sure that there is a governmental institution that holds this money as a caretaker for them to decide how this will be managed on behalf of the nation. Now that's paternalistic, it's insulting, and it really shouldn't be happening, not in a country that calls itself democratic. And I'm not just picking on this continent, but I tend to pick on a lot of other countries too. So what are the symptoms of disempowerment? I will argue that I think not having total inalienable ownership to your minerals results in a blow to cultural integrity. I think that this mining in Gulf Peninsula and in other places, the vast majority of places, is an abrogation of traditional law. There's a sense of defeat. The strongest cultural power of an indigenous nation having been defeated for the purpose of bauxite or other mining. To me, I don't see how the self, the indigenous self, that may have only known one specific dominant cultural narrative in their lives, how they can really rebound from this. Does this exacerbate social, economic, and political ills? Quantifying this, as we'll come to see, is difficult, but I will argue, and I'm happy to argue about it, that I think it does. I don't think it helps the situation in any case. Now, the key is that the Yolngu are not able to profit from the resources of their own land in their own way. It's kept by governmental institutions for the benefit of the Yolngu people. To me, I really want to stress that this removes the power of the nation to stand on its own. And we'll go and have a look at the other case study of total ownership, the Hekaria Apache tribe in what's today the USA. So their traditional lands at around 14th century came around the Grand Junction, just a little bit toward this border marking. I'm told that's where these people came to settle originally. Now, colonization and pressures on other nations caused a migration further south to where that A is, just in New Mexico, and that's where the reservation of the Hekaria Apache people is. They retain full legal rights to oil and gas wells. The nation owns this. They're in a position of power. They can have the veto and say, no, we're not interested in oil exploration or mining or anything. Or they have the power to say, we're interested in receiving expressions of interest, or we'd like to grant tender to the best contract. And the way I understand it is that the governing council of this nation works with the US government, state government, and mining companies together to come forward and bring a contract for resource exploitation that satisfies, or at least tries to satisfy all parties. The tribe has the right to profit from, so mine it themselves or extract the resources themselves, or to tax a non-indigenous company to do it on their behalf. The tribe has the ability to set that tax rate for themselves. They decide how much they're going to get. Although this is happening in reservations that are a product of colonial times, I think it's extremely important to still stress that they have control over their own governance and their own subsurface resources. In the end, I think that this puts indigenous people on a much stronger footing. I think the Hekaria are much stronger in their national integrity, in their cultural integrity, than the Yolngu or other peoples in this world that don't have the same legal right, that hard realpolitik. I think they have a much greater chance for preserving their culture, for developing their nation further, and of exploring this intra-national form of governance. It's almost like they have control over their destiny in a way that would not be possible without access or ownership to oil. For example, if a company wanted to come through to gain access to this oil or to do other mining, the Hekare Nation would have to be moved. I don't see how you can really go about trying to frame yourself a nation, a citizenry of sorts, within a boundary if you just don't have right to that land. You can't stay there. There's nothing guaranteed. So, for those that have rights, the story is a different one. It's about standing on your own. Winning subsurface minerals grants recognition to an Indigenous nation, and getting that also results in surface ownership. So if you win the subsurface, typically you also get total ownership of surface rights, so they're binary. And in the case studies, the few ones that exist displaying good news, the narrative is of empowerment. Serious gains, cold hard economic and legal empowerment. Of course, there's still problems. There are very few Indigenous peoples that have these rights, and this is quite rare. Now, the second point, Indigenous or non-Indigenous, if we're outside of a nation in question that has won rights to minerals, is it within our moral right to engage with members of this community to ask how they're going to approach mining, if they want to, if mining happens, how that wealth is going to be redistributed within the community? Corruption, for example, is a problem in many reservations, such as in what's today called Canada. The band council will get rents, and some of them don't distribute this wealth beyond family and friends. So you have a huge economic, social, and political disparity. And I think we're all familiar with those problems. Now, the third point, and this again comes back to the legal discussion, any subsurface rights should, I think, must be granted within the toughest form of public law available in whatever legal context we might be looking at. Otherwise, a new government might come in. This might result in a reversal of former promises or former laws. So enshrinement in public law, I think, is very important. Okay, let's have a small rest here. Let's recap what we've gone over. I'm trying to batter this one in. We've established that Indigenous peoples generally don't have total ownership of minerals, even those that own total surface rights. We've also made the point that ownership of minerals is a boon for cultures. Yes, it provides the same, it doesn't take away the difficulties of risks of being duped or hoodwinked by unscrupulous governments or unsavory companies, or of splits in the nation going and making deals behind other people's backs, as often happens, and that results in its own problems. But what it does do is give them the opportunity to have the power to just go and do their own thing, and to decide when it's time to engage with other people, or how to engage, and how to preserve or grow their culture. One good example is the Crow Nation in the USA. I think a recent figure had it that they were the third or fourth fastest growing self-identified ethnicity in the USA. So this is really promising news. So these rights coming through in the US are giving people a good boost in cultural power, we'll put it that way. Now, I think one thing we didn't really talk about is this denial of mining. I think that's a pretty key thing to recall. If one has ownership of rights, then one theoretically then has the right to deny any mining or resource exploitation. Now, we're going to come to discuss what this means for industry, but I think it's a benefit. We'll come to that a bit later. And finally, we've mentioned that lack of ownership, results in these qualitative buzzwords: bad, corrosive, disempowering. These are all, I think, related to some kind of phenomenon or phenomena that results in pulling apart this sovereignty and making profane what used to be a sacred culture, and really going through and abrogating these traditional rights. So, we're going to go to laws, but before then, I need to stress why losing indigenous peoples. So recall in the Amazon, or sorry, in Ecuador, how there was discussion in this Al Jazeera piece on the risk of existential threat of human beings going on a type of endangered list. First, negative impacts are difficult to quantify. I wouldn't say impossible, but they're difficult. My research is mainly qualitative. I'm looking at law, literature, and primary textual evidence. Now there's scope for economic, health, and socio-political metrics to compare and contrast indigenous peoples that might fall on either side of the Rubicon. Now I'm not sure if anyone is doing this research on a specific topic, and there's a lot of comparative analysis going on between nations, but on the topic of subsurface rights, I'm not sure if that's really happening. Despite that, I think it's fairly clear that many indigenous peoples are considered to be losing ground rather than gaining it. Losing cultural uniqueness, language, their teleological outlooks, visions for the future of how the good life should be lived, their own unique cultural practices and places. Indigenous peoples offer multifarious ways for humans to envision the world. It's different to what I would say is the global consumerist culture. Now this is a little blurb that I took out of the end of my paper. I'd like to read it out to you guys. The morbid thought of a global homogenized materialist society, in the consumer sense, where each individual pursues the quest of things for the sake of things is confounding. IPs are an outlet of learning concerning a differing telos or multiple realities of existence. They offer the opportunity to break away from the tyranny of money by operating beyond its structured paradigm, or to increasingly focus on human relationships or the depths of the individual, rather to simply waste a life in the pursuit of wealth, which invariably becomes meaningless after death. I will add a caveat to that. If you have established a very good trust fund and set up your wealth for future generations to enjoy, I mean, that's obviously not a waste, but this was just to give a contrast of what indigenous peoples, and of course it's multifarious, extremely diverse, they're all not offering the same thing, but that's just one point. Indigenous peoples, in my view, contribute diversity to human ecology. And I think diversity in all walks of life still reigns king. I'd say that women can be kings, so I'm not getting into one gender here. To go any further, we're going to have to take a quick look at law. So my argument is really juxtaposed on having ownership enshrined in law. I will argue that the USA, New Zealand, and Canada, in that order, have the most progressive laws concerning ownership. The frameworks, I think, those three, are much more advanced than in Australia, and dramatically more so than the other cases I looked at, which are Brazil, Paraguay, South Africa, and Namibia. I just grabbed this right out of the paper. Sorry if it doesn't look as nice. And I think we might be running a bit short, but we'll go through it quickly. In Australia, just have a look at Act 2, Aboriginal Land Rights, Northern Territory. The Northern Territory holds the authority to determine mining activity on Aboriginal land. I'm happy to argue about this point, but I don't think there's any evidence showing contrary to that this embargo period given to whichever indigenous person might, or nation might be in question, there is no veto power behind that. To me, this is ersatz act. It's really an empty gesture. At the end of the day, it's still government and mining companies that have say. The Act 3 prohibits mining damages to the land, but does not mention ownership of land or minerals. That, I think, relates more to protecting environment, doing mining in an accessible way that doesn't create huge amounts of pollution, which are growing standards, of course, today. Now, in Canada, the one I want to point out is number 3 down at the bottom, Band Council for oil and gas exploration. Band Council, so the governing body of a nation, has the right to grant tender to grant exploration, extraction, and they typically work with an agent from the government and representatives from the mining company in question. They also have some ability to decide how much rents, taxation benefit from this will go to the nation itself. Again, this all comes down to a case-by-case basis. We don't know who or what is doing the redistribution, and I think it would vary from place to place. Now, let's take a moment here. The USA. Number 3, Marion versus Hekurea Apache Tribe, 1982. Are there anyone in this room familiar with that act? Okay, this is sexy stuff. This is a landmark. What we have is indigenous peoples are legally permitted to tax any mineral on their lands, and they can exploit it themselves. That's enshrined in law. And I think that was a key factor in getting this $3.4 billion repayment last year. In my research, I haven't seen any other country in the world that has this kind of recognition and protection. I know in the USA that indigenous people are viewed as nations within a nation, sovereign peoples within a different sovereign territory. And I think Obama, was it last year, I think he holds something like 3 or 4 conferences with First Nations in the USA. So this is a lot, big multinational, so nations being indigenous people, multifarious numbers of them coming through, having a conference, and being involved to some extent in the governance of the USA. I don't think that this is comparable to anywhere else. At least not. Maybe in Bolivia, but we can draw on that later. Let's just quickly look to New Zealand. We won't have time to go through Brazil, Paraguay, and that, but the reason why I think New Zealand is either on par with the US or slightly behind has to do with these 2 acts. The lessor shall pay a fair compensation to the lessee for minerals or other resource extraction. Second point, the Maori trustee may grant licenses for the removal of timber, timber trees, and minerals. Now, it's not as explicit as the US legal code in saying that Maori or indigenous people in New Zealand can deny mining. I'm not sure if they have the right to go and say to the government, maybe the government is interested, or a company to go and mine a very important mineral for, I'm not sure, research or something, or the military, or for economic benefits, but I'm not sure if Maoris have the right to just to say no, like the Hekurea in the US. If anyone knows, I'd be glad to discuss later. Now, very simply put, I would say the US falls very much in this advanced legal framework, then New Zealand and Canada, where indigenous people, they're big, they can walk, they can stand on their own 2 feet, at least, those that have been going, this is still very recent, right, but those that have had the ability to start benefiting from these laws, they can come in as equal partners. They have veto power. This is not some flimsy fake lip service that's being paid, as it often is to other peoples throughout the world. In Australia, in the vast majority of other countries, and again, I'm very happy to argue about any of these points and to hear more evidence about places that I've missed, because I only had 8 case studies and in a thorough literature review, in English mainly and Spanish. Indigenous peoples, right, big contrast, they're small. They don't have the ability to go and bargain. They don't have veto power. And this, to me, says everything. It just doesn't give people the right to develop themselves in their own culturally relevant ways. And that is very troubling. So, nearing the end of this talk, this is, of course, very important to the interests of mining companies. Although, of course, I am very much more sympathetic to indigenous people, because they are the most, as far as we know, marginalized populations in the world, especially female indigenous people. We call that a double marginalization. And because of that, I think that they really do need to have these total ownerships. But for mining companies, does anyone know what this is? Yes, uranium. Market value from around this month, give or take $90,000 US per ton. this is one of 15 or 17 rare earth metals. Market value, somewhere around last year, give or take $110,000 per ton. It was, I'm told, much cheaper than that in 2010, so if any savvy investors bought in then, good job. Diamonds. Market value from around last year, $270,000 per ounce. I'm not sure how many ounces there are in a diamond mine, and this is, I'm told, the price for the medium carat quality, whatever that means. So. And finally, there's this glamorous, beautiful beast, coal, coming in at $84.95 per ton. The point is, all of these minerals are mined in Australia today, and obviously, depending on how much there are in there, in the mine, it's extremely lucrative. So there's a lot of money to be made, which of course I think is the major prerogative of mining companies, right? They're there to make money. So what does empowering Indigenous people do to subsurface, to mining companies? Initially this seems like it would be making mining, the business of mining, more difficult. I'm going to try to argue that I don't think that this is an entirely bad thing, or a bad thing at all. First, I think that it's going to force a different type of innovation, and this innovation, this kind of pressure, is already happening on mining companies throughout the world. I mean, this is a descriptive talk. I'm not, making some kind of new claims. This is already underway. So mining companies are already feeling this pressure. And my contention, however, is that this is going to force a slightly more capacious form of corporate social responsibility that is going to result in companies having to be basically better partnership builders than others. If you can come across and build a sustainable, ongoing relationship with an indigenous population, and they're actually interested in going through and trying to benefit from the minerals that are theirs, then you're going to have a distinct market advantage over other companies, especially if those, I won't name them, are obviously carrying bad reputations. It's going to change and I think it is changing the rules of the game slightly, that we can talk about more later. Now, in the end, right at the bottom, sorry we're short on time, it's a win-win situation for me. So there's a growing focus, and I'd just like to make this point before we're tapering off. These ones we know quite well, right? Environmental protection, technological innovation, these have been core mandates for the mining industry, along with profit making and all the other themes associated with running a business. But there are two other ones, as I mentioned, IP ownership and then citizen approval. So I think Indigenous peoples, right, their citizenry is onto their own, however they like to define themselves, and often they appear as nations within a nation, even though they may not have recognition as such. And I think that mining companies increasingly need to engage citizens, and by way of citizens, Indigenous people. Now, this citizen point, in Australia we had a recent example. The public was involved, to some extent, in the debate over wealth redistribution of mining, right? I think Kevin Rudd stretched his neck out a bit too far and got axed for that. But I think he put a good stand, and it was a good debate, although the public wasn't as involved as I would have liked it to have been. Indigenous ownership, we just covered the possible hurdles, but in a slight change into the way that mining companies will have to approach things. But I think that this is just a kind of a recomposition of corporate social responsibility. I think increasingly, if mining companies do not engage in citizen approval, the recognition, at least, and hopefully the promotion for IP ownership, and of course environmental protection and innovation in technology, they're going to be left behind. I don't see how the normative political and social atmosphere, and I'm trying to speak on a global cosmopolitan scale, I don't see how that is going to permit mining companies to not work closer with citizens and Indigenous peoples. Mining companies are not private anymore. They haven't been for a long time. These are greatly impacting activities on human communities. And for that, I think that they're public. and that they, because of the act of their resource extraction, they're part of the public fora and should be engaging the public in that sense. I'd like to thank you all for giving me your time, and I hope we can continue this discussion further.